World War II was a war of machines as much as men. And on the battlefields of Europe, no machines were more iconic or more controversial than the American M4 Sherman and the German Panzerkampfwagen Fiat Panther. For decades, historians, veterans, and armchair generals have argued about which tank was better, which was deadlier, and which truly defined the armored battles of the Second World War. But the real story is more complicated than any simple comparison of armor thickness or gun caliber. It's a story of design philosophy, battlefield tactics, and the human experience inside a steel beast. Let's set the stage. It's the summer of 1944. The Allies have landed in Normandy, and the race is on to liberate France and push into the heart of Nazi Germany. American, British, and Canadian forces are advancing through the hedgerows, villages, and fields of northern France. The Germans, reeling from the shock of D-Day, are scrambling to regroup and counterattack. In this crucible, two tanks will meet again and again, the Sherman and the Panther. The M4 Sherman was the workhorse of the U.S. Army. By the end of the war, more than 49,000 Shermans had rolled off American assembly lines. It was a tank designed for mass production, reliability, and ease of maintenance. Its 75mm gun was effective against most targets, and its armor was good enough to protect against small arms and shrapnel. But the Sherman was not the heaviest or most powerful tank on the battlefield. It was built to be fast, maneuverable, and easy to repair. A tank for a global war fought on many fronts. The Panther, by contrast, was Germany's answer to the shock of facing Soviet T-34s on the Eastern Front. Introduced in 1943, the Panther was a technological marvel, sloped armor for better protection, a high-velocity 75mm gun that could penetrate almost any Allied tank, and a powerful engine that gave it speed and agility. But the Panther was also complex, expensive, and prone to mechanical problems. Only about 6,000 were built, and each one required skilled crews and constant maintenance. For the men who fought in these tanks, the differences were more than just numbers on a spec sheet. American tankers called their Shermans Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up the first time every time when hit. German crews, meanwhile, respected the Panther's firepower, but cursed its reliability. Both sides knew that survival depended as much on luck, training, and tactics as on the machine itself. The first major clashes between Shermans and Panthers came in the hedgerows of Normandy. The Bocage country was a nightmare for tanks, narrow lanes, thick hedges, and hidden German anti-tank guns at every turn. Shermans advanced in columns, using speed and numbers to overwhelm defenders. Panthers, often dug in or hidden, waited for the perfect shot. The result was a deadly game of cat and mouse, with high casualties on both sides. American crews quickly learned to fear the Panther's gun. At long range, the Sherman's 75mm rounds often bounced off the Panther's sloped front armor, while the German 75mm could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. Tank duels were often decided by who saw whom first, who fired first, and who could maneuver into a flanking position. The U.S. Army responded by introducing the 76mm armed Sherman and the M36 Jackson tank destroyer, but the basic problem remained. The Panther was a formidable opponent. But the story doesn't end there. The Sherman had advantages that statistics can't always capture. It was reliable, easy to fix, and could be produced in huge numbers. When a Sherman was knocked out, another could take its place within days. Crews could be trained quickly, and spare parts were always available. The Sherman's mobility and the U.S. Army's emphasis on combined arms, using tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support together, meant that American units could keep moving, even in the face of heavy losses. The Panther, for all its strengths, was a victim of its own complexity. Its engine and transmission were prone to breakdowns, especially in the muddy, rough terrain of France and the Eastern Front. Repairs took time and skilled mechanics, and spare parts were often in short supply. Panthers were sometimes abandoned simply because they couldn't be fixed in time. German crews, facing relentless Allied air attacks and supply shortages, often had to fight with what they had, not what they wanted. The human side of the tank duel was just as important as the technical one. American tankers, many of them barely out of high school, faced the terror of combat with courage and camaraderie. They learned to work as a team, to trust their training, and to rely on each other when the shells started flying. German crews, often veterans of years of brutal fighting, brought experience and discipline to the battlefield. But they also faced exhaustion, dwindling resources, and the knowledge that the war was slipping away. In the end, the Sherman versus Panther duel was about more than just tanks. It was about the clash of two different ways of fighting a war: the American emphasis on mass production, mobility, and combined arms, versus the German focus on firepower, armor, and tactical superiority. It was a battle fought not just with steel and gunpowder, but with ideas, innovation, and the will to win. In the next section, we'll dive deeper into the design philosophies behind the Sherman and the Panther. We'll explore how each tank was developed, what the engineers and generals were thinking, and how those decisions shaped the way the tanks performed on the battlefield. We'll also hear from the men who built and fought in these machines, and see how their experiences reveal the real story behind WWII's most controversial tank duel. To truly understand the Sherman versus Panther rivalry, you have to go back to the drawing boards, literally. The story of these two tanks is the story of two nations, two armies, and two very different ways of thinking about war. The Sherman and the Panther weren't just built differently, they were built for different wars, different strategies, and different visions of victory. Let's start with the Sherman. When the United States entered World War II, its military planners knew they needed a tank that could be built fast, shipped anywhere in the world, and maintained by crews with minimal training. The result was the M4 Sherman, a tank that was, above all, reliable and easy to produce. American factories could turn out thousands of Shermans every month, and the parts were so standardized that a transmission from one tank could be swapped into another on the battlefield. The Sherman's design reflected America's industrial might and its global strategy. The U.S. Army needed a tank that could fight in North Africa, Italy, France, and the Pacific. It had to be light enough to cross weak bridges, small enough to fit on landing craft, and simple enough to be fixed with basic tools. The Sherman's 75mm gun was chosen because it could fire high-explosive shells as well as armor-piercing rounds, making it useful against both tanks and infantry. Its armor was thick enough to stop most anti-tank weapons of the early war, but not so heavy that it slowed the tank down or made it hard to transport. The Panther, on the other hand, was born out of crisis. In 1941, German forces on the Eastern Front ran headlong into the Soviet T-34, a tank that was fast, well-armored, and armed with a powerful 76mm gun. The T-34 shocked the Germans, who realized their own Panzer III and feed tanks were suddenly outclassed. The response was the Panther, a tank designed to outgun and outlast the T-34, with sloped armor for better protection and a high-velocity 75mm gun that could penetrate almost any Allied tank. But the Panther's design came with trade-offs. It was heavier, more complex, and much harder to build than the Sherman. Its engine and transmission were advanced but prone to breakdowns, especially in the muddy, rough terrain of the Eastern Front and Normandy. The Panther's suspension system, with its interleaved road wheels, gave it a smooth ride, but was a nightmare to repair in the field. And while its armor was excellent from the front, it was thinner on the sides and rear, making it vulnerable to flanking attacks. The differences in design philosophy went beyond the tanks themselves. The U.S. Army believed in combined arms warfare, using tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support together to overwhelm the enemy. The Sherman was designed to be part of a team, not a lone wolf. American tank units trained to work closely with infantry, to call in artillery strikes, and to rely on air cover when facing tough opposition. If a Sherman was knocked out, another could take its place within days. The focus was on keeping the advance moving, not on winning a duel with a single enemy tank. The German approach was different. The Wehrmacht prized tactical superiority and the ability to win head-to-head battles. The Panther was designed to dominate the battlefield, to take on enemy tanks and win through superior firepower and armor. German tank doctrine emphasized ambushes, defensive positions, and the use of terrain to maximize the Panther's strengths. But as the war dragged on and resources dwindled, the Germans found it harder and harder to keep their Panthers running, supplied, and supported. The human side of these design choices was just as important. American tankers often joked that the Sherman was a tank designed by people who never had to fight in one. It was cramped, noisy, and, when hit, prone to catching fire. But it was also forgiving, easy to drive, and quick to repair. Crews could be trained in weeks, and replacements were always available. The Sherman's reliability meant that American units could keep fighting, even after taking heavy losses. German Panther crews, by contrast, were often veterans with years of experience. They respected their tank's power, but knew its weaknesses all too well. A broken track or a blown transmission could leave a Panther stranded for days. Spare parts were scarce, and field repairs were difficult. Panther crews had to be mechanics as well as fighters, constantly working to keep their tanks in action. And as the war turned against Germany, the pressure mounted. Every lost Panther was a blow to the defense, and every breakdown was a potential disaster. The differences in design philosophy also shaped the way the tanks were used in battle. In Normandy, Shermans advanced in columns, using speed and numbers to overwhelm German defenses. Panthers, often dug in or hidden, waited for the perfect shot. The result was a deadly game of cat and mouse with high casualties on both sides. American crews learned to fear the Panther's gun, but they also learned to use their own advantages: mobility, teamwork, and the ability to call in support. The Panther's complexity was both its strength and its Achilles heel. In the right hands, on the right ground, it was a killer. But in the mud, snow, and chaos of real combat, its weaknesses became clear. Panthers were sometimes abandoned simply because they couldn't be fixed in time. German crews facing relentless Allied air attacks and supply shortages often had to fight with what they had, not what they wanted. The Sherman, by contrast, was always there. When one was knocked out, another took its place. When a track broke, it could be fixed in hours. When a crew was lost, replacements were ready. The Sherman's reliability and the U.S. Army's emphasis on logistics and support meant that American units could keep moving, even in the face of heavy losses. The story of the Sherman and the Panther is a story of two different wars. The Germans built tanks to win battles. The Americans built tanks to win the war. The Panther was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was a tank for a war Germany could no longer fight. A war of maneuver, surprise, and tactical brilliance. The Sherman was a tank for a war of attrition, logistics, and overwhelming force. In the end, the real story of the Sherman versus Panther duel is not about which tank was better. It's about how each tank reflected the strengths and weaknesses of the armies that built them. It's about the men who fought in them, the choices they made, and the world they helped to shape. In the next section, we'll go inside the tanks themselves, exploring what it was like to fight, live, and sometimes die in a Sherman or a Panther. We'll hear from the crews who manned these machines and see how their experiences reveal the true nature of armored warfare in World War II. To truly understand the Sherman versus Panther rivalry, you have to step inside the tanks themselves. Forget the blueprints and the statistics for a moment. What was it really like to fight, live, and sometimes die in these steel beasts? The answer is a story of fear, courage, teamwork, and the relentless pressure of combat. Let's start with the Sherman. For most American tankers, the M4 was their first, and sometimes only, home on the battlefield. The inside of a Sherman was cramped, noisy, and hot. The crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, worked in close quarters, surrounded by steel, ammunition, and the constant smell of oil and gasoline. When the tank was buttoned up, visibility was limited to narrow periscopes and vision slits. Communication was by intercom, and every order had to be clear and quick. Despite its reputation as a death trap, many Sherman crews grew attached to their tanks. They gave them names: Thunderbolt, Cobra King, Battling Bitch, and decorated them with pin-up art, lucky charms, and personal touches. The Sherman was reliable, easy to drive, and forgiving. If a track broke or an engine failed, the crew could often fix it themselves, sometimes under fire. Spare parts were plentiful, and maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the tanks running. But the dangers were real. The Sherman's armor, while adequate against small arms and shrapnel, was vulnerable to German anti-tank guns and the high-velocity shells of the Panther. When a Sherman was hit, the results could be catastrophic. The tank's gasoline engine and ammunition storage made it prone to catching fire. a fact that led to the grim nickname Ronson, after the cigarette lighter that lights up the first time, every time. Later models added wet stowage for ammunition, reducing the risk of fire, but the fear never went away. For Sherman crews, survival depended on teamwork, training, and luck. The commander had to keep his head on a swivel, scanning for threats and directing the driver and gunner. The loader had to keep the gun fed and ready, while the driver and assistant driver watched for mines, obstacles, and ambushes. In battle, seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Crews learned to shoot and scoot, to use cover, and to rely on infantry and artillery support. Now step inside the Panther. For German crews, the Panther was a source of pride and frustration. The tank was larger and more spacious than the Sherman, with a powerful engine and a gun that could destroy any Allied tank at long range. The sloped armor provided excellent protection from the front, and the optics were among the best in the world. The crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, had more room to work, and the tank's firepower gave them confidence in battle. But the Panther was also a demanding machine. Its engine and transmission were complex and prone to breakdowns, especially in the mud and cold of the Eastern Front or the bocage of Normandy. The interleaved road wheels, while providing a smooth ride, were a nightmare to repair if damaged. Spare parts were often scarce, and field repairs could take hours or even days. Panther crews had to be mechanics as well as fighters, constantly working to keep their tanks in action. In combat, the Panther was a formidable opponent. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun could penetrate the armor of any Allied tank at long range, and its frontal armor was nearly impervious to most Allied shells. German crews used their tanks as snipers, setting up ambushes and firing from concealed positions. In the right hands, a Panther could dominate a battlefield. But the Panther had its weaknesses. Its side and rear armor were thinner, making it vulnerable to flanking attacks. The turret traverse was slower than the Sherman's, and the tank's size made it harder to hide. In the chaos of battle, Panthers were often targeted by artillery, airstrikes, and infantry anti-tank teams. When a Panther was hit, the crew had to bail out quickly, sometimes under fire. For both Sherman and Panther crews, the psychological pressure was immense. Tank battles were loud, violent, and terrifying. The clang of shells on armor, the roar of engines, the shouts of the crew, all combined to create a sensory overload. Crews lived with the constant fear of being hit, of burning alive, or of being trapped inside a disabled tank. Many tankers suffered from what we now call PTSD, haunted by memories of friends lost and battles survived. Yet, there was also camaraderie, pride, and even moments of humor. Tank crews became close-knit teams, relying on each other for survival. They shared stories, jokes, and dreams of home. They celebrated victories and mourned losses together. For many, the bond formed inside a tank was stronger than any other. The human side of the Sherman versus Panther duel is often overlooked in the debates about armor and firepower. But for the men who fought in these tanks, the experience was about more than just machines. It was about courage under fire, the will to keep fighting, and the hope of making it through another day. The stories of individual tankers bring the rivalry to life. American crews like those of Cobra King, the first Sherman to break through to Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, or the men of the 4th Armored Division who faced Panthers in the hedgerows of Normandy. German aces like Ernst Barkmann, who claimed dozens of kills in his Panther, or the crews who fought to the last in the ruins of Berlin. These stories reveal the true nature of armored warfare in World War II. It wasn't just about which tank was better on paper. It was about who could adapt, who could work as a team, and who could keep fighting when everything seemed lost. In the next section, we'll look at the tactics and strategies that shaped the Sherman versus Panther battles. We'll see how both sides learned from experience, adapted to new threats, and tried to gain the upper hand in the deadly chess game of tank warfare. The clash between the Sherman and the Panther was never just a matter of hardware. It was a contest of wits, nerves, and adaptation, a chess match played out in the mud, hedgerows, and villages of Europe. Both sides learned quickly that survival depended on more than just armor and firepower. It was about who could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the other. For American tankers, facing a Panther was a test of nerves. The Panther S long-barreled 75-meter gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman ES owned 75-meter rounds would simply bounce off the Panther AS sloped front armor. The first rule for Sherman crews was simple: never fight a Panther head-on if you could help it. Instead, they relied on speed, teamwork, and tactics to even the odds. One of the most effective American tactics was the shoot and scoot. Sherman crews would fire a quick shot, then immediately move to a new position before the Panther could return fire. The Sherman's faster turret traverse and more responsive controls gave it an edge in close-quarters fighting, especially in the bocage country of Normandy, where hedgerows and narrow lanes limited the Panther's ability to use its range advantage. Flanking was the key. If a Sherman could get around to the side or rear of a Panther, its gun had a much better chance of penetrating the thinner armor. American tankers learned to work in teams, with one tank drawing the Panther AS attention while another maneuvered for a shot at the vulnerable side. Infantry support was also crucial. GIs with bazookas or anti-tank grenades could ambush Panthers in towns or forests, forcing the German tanks to fight in close quarters where their long-range guns were less effective. Artillery and air support played a huge role. When a Panther was spotted, American units would call in artillery barrages or fighter-bomber strikes. The U.S. Army's doctrine of combined arms, using tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power together, meant that even the most powerful German tank could be overwhelmed by coordinated attacks. The Sherman was never meant to fight alone. It was part of a team. On the German side, Panther crews developed their own tactics to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. The Panther was at its best in defensive positions, where it could use its powerful gun and thick frontal armor to dominate open ground. German tank commanders often set up ambushes, hiding their Panthers in woods or behind ridges, waiting for Allied tanks to come into range. The first shot was everything. A well-placed Panther could knock out several Shermans before the Americans even knew where the fire was coming from. But the Germans faced their own challenges. The Panther's mechanical reliability was always a concern. Breakdowns were common, and a disabled Panther was a sitting duck. Fuel shortages meant that Panthers often had to be used sparingly, held in reserve for key battles or counterattacks. As the war dragged on, the Germans had fewer and fewer experienced crews, and replacements were often rushed into combat with minimal training. The terrain also played a role. In the open fields of Russia or northern France, the Panther's range and firepower were deadly. But in the dense hedgerows of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, or the rubble-strewn streets of German cities, the Panther's size and slower turret traverse became liabilities. American tankers learned to use the terrain to their advantage, closing the distance and attacking from unexpected angles. Communication was another factor. American tanks were equipped with reliable radios, allowing crews to coordinate their movements, call for support, and share information about enemy positions. German tanks often had less effective radio equipment, and as the war went on, shortages and damage made communication even more difficult. This gave the Americans a crucial edge in fast-moving battles. The psychological aspect of tank combat was ever present. Sherman crews knew the odds were against them in a straight-up duel with a Panther, but they also knew that numbers, speed, and teamwork could turn the tide. The U.S. Army's ability to replace lost tanks and crews quickly meant that American units could keep up the pressure, even after taking heavy losses. For German crews, every lost Panther was a blow that could not easily be replaced. One of the most famous tank battles of the war, the Battle of Ardennes in September 1944, showed how tactics could overcome technology. Outnumbered and outgunned, American tankers used fog, maneuver, and aggressive tactics to ambush and destroy a superior German force, including many Panthers. The victory was a testament to the importance of training, leadership, and adaptability. The Panther's reputation as a tank killer was well-deserved, but it was not invincible. American crews learned to respect the Panther, but they also learned to fight smart. They used every advantage they had: mobility, numbers, artillery, air support, and the ability to repair and replace tanks quickly. The result was a war of attrition that the Germans could not win. For the men inside the tanks, every battle was a test of courage and skill. They faced the constant threat of death. the fear of being trapped in a burning tank, and the pressure to keep fighting no matter what. The bond between crew members was unbreakable, forged in the heat of combat and the shared struggle to survive. The Sherman versus Panther duel was not just a contest of machines, it was a contest of wills. It was about who could adapt, who could learn, and who could keep fighting when everything seemed lost. In the end, it was the Americans' ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast their opponents that made the difference. In the next section, we'll look at the aftermath of the tank battles, the lessons learned, the myths and realities that emerged, and how the Sherman and Panther influenced the design of future tanks. We'll also hear from veterans and historians about what these legendary machines really meant to the men who fought in them and to the world they helped to shape. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the fields, forests, and villages of the continent were littered with the wrecks of tanks, Shermans, Panthers, and many others. The war was over, but the debate about which tank was better was just beginning. For the men who fought in them, the answer was never simple. For historians, engineers, and military planners, the lessons of the Sherman versus Panther duel would shape the future of armored warfare for generations. Let's start with the numbers. The United States built over 49,000 Shermans during the war. Germany built about 6,000 Panthers. The Sherman was everywhere, on the beaches of Normandy, in the hedgerows of France, in the forests of the Ardennes, and on the streets of Berlin. The Panther, by contrast, was always outnumbered, always fighting against the odds. In a straight-up duel, the Panther had the edge in firepower and armor, but war is rarely a fair fight. The myth of the Croix and invincible Ardennes Panther and the death-trap Sherman grew in the years after the war. Movies, books, and even some veterans' accounts painted the Sherman as hopelessly outclassed, a rolling coffin that could only win by sheer numbers. The Panther, meanwhile, was often portrayed as the ultimate tank, unstoppable, unbeatable, and tragically doomed by German logistics and leadership. But the reality, as always, was more complicated. The Sherman had its flaws: thin armor, a tendency to catch fire when hit, and a main gun that struggled against the Panther's front armor. But it was also reliable, easy to repair, and could be produced in huge numbers. Its mobility, standardized parts, and the U.S. Army's focus on combined arms meant that American tank units could keep fighting, even after taking heavy losses. The Panther, for all its strengths, was a victim of its own complexity. Its powerful gun and sloped armor made it deadly in a head-to-head fight, but its mechanical reliability was always suspect. Panthers broke down often and field repairs were difficult. Fuel shortages, spare parts problems, and the relentless pressure of Allied air power meant that many Panthers were lost without ever firing a shot. German crews respected their tanks, but they also knew the frustration of being stranded or forced to abandon a perfectly good machine because it couldn't be fixed in time. The lessons learned from the Sherman versus Panther duel had a profound impact on post-war tank design. American engineers focused on reliability, ease of maintenance, and the ability to mass-produce tanks quickly. The M26 Pershing, M46, and later the M48 and M60 Patton tanks all reflected these priorities. The Soviets, too, learned from the Panther's strengths and weaknesses, incorporating sloped armor and powerful guns into their T-54 and T-55 designs, but always with an eye toward simplicity and mass production. The debate about which tank was better often misses the point. The Sherman and the Panther were products of their respective nations' strategies, resources, and philosophies. The Sherman was a tank for a global war, a machine that could be built, shipped, and maintained anywhere in the world. The Panther was a tank for a war of maneuver and tactical brilliance, a weapon designed to win battles, not wars. For the men who fought in them, the tanks were more than just machines. They were homes, workplaces, and sometimes coffins. The bond between crew members was forged in the heat of battle, in the shared struggle to survive. American tankers learned to trust their training, their teamwork, and their ability to adapt. German crews relied on discipline, experience, and the power of their machines. Both sides knew that luck played as big a role as skill. The legacy of the Sherman versus Panther duel lives on in the stories of the men who fought in them. Veterans' accounts are filled with tales of terror, courage, and sometimes humor. Sherman crews joked about their tanks being Ronsons, but they also took pride in their ability to keep fighting, no matter what. Panther crews boasted of their kills, but they also remembered the frustration of breakdowns and the fear of being caught without support. Historians continue to debate the merits of each tank. Some argue that the Panther was the best tank of the war, hampered only by German logistics and leadership. Others point out that the Sherman's reliability, numbers, and the U.S. Army's combined arms doctrine were what really won the war. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. The myth of the invincible Panther and the death trap Sherman has been challenged by recent research. Studies of battlefield wrecks, after-action reports, and interviews with veterans show that both tanks had their strengths and weaknesses. The Sherman's reputation for catching fire was largely due to early models with dry ammunition storage. Later models with wet stowage were much safer. The Panther's armor was formidable, but its side and rear were vulnerable, and its mechanical reliability was always a concern. The real lesson of the Sherman versus Panther duel is that war is about more than just machines. It's about people, about the crews who fought, the mechanics who kept the tanks running, the planners who devised tactics, and the leaders who made decisions. It's about the ability to adapt, to learn, and to keep fighting in the face of adversity. The Sherman and the Panther both left their mark on history. The Sherman became a symbol of American industrial might and the power of teamwork. The Panther became a symbol of German engineering and the quest for battlefield superiority. Both tanks are remembered, restored, and revered by enthusiasts and historians around the world. Today you can see Shermans and Panthers in museums, at reenactments, and even in movies and video games. They are reminders of a time when the fate of nations was decided by steel and fire, by the courage of crews and the ingenuity of engineers. The debate about which tank was better will probably never end, but maybe that's the point. The real story is not about who won the duel, but about what we can learn from it. In the final section, we'll reflect on the enduring legacy of the Sherman versus Panther rivalry, how it continues to shape our understanding of World War II, what it teaches us about technology and war, and why the human stories inside those steel beasts matter most of all. The Sherman versus Panther debate didn't end with the war, and it hasn't ended in the decades since. In fact, it's only grown more passionate as historians, veterans, modelers, gamers, and military enthusiasts have weighed in. But what does this legendary tank duel really mean for us today? What lessons can we draw from the clash of these two iconic machines and the men who fought in them? First, the Sherman versus Panther story is a powerful reminder that war is never just about technology. Yes, the Panther had the better gun and thicker armor. Yes, the Sherman was more reliable and easier to fix. But neither tank could win the war on its own. The outcome depended on logistics, training, leadership, and the ability to adapt. The U.S. Army's focus on combined arms, mass production, and keeping the supply lines open was just as important as the Sherman's design. The German emphasis on tactical superiority and engineering excellence was impressive, but it couldn't overcome shortages of fuel, spare parts, and experienced crews. Second, the rivalry shows the importance of context. The Panther was designed to fight Soviet T-34s on the open plains of Russia, not Shermans in the hedgerows of Normandy. The Sherman was built for a global war, where getting tanks to the battlefield and keeping them running was more important than winning a one-on-one duel. Both tanks were products of their time, their nations, and the unique challenges they faced. Third, the human stories matter most. For the men inside these tanks, the duel was personal. It was about survival, about protecting your buddies, about doing your job under the most terrifying conditions imaginable. The bond between tank crew members was forged in fire. They trusted each other with their lives, and they learned to rely on their training, their instincts, and sometimes just plain luck. The stories of Sherman and Panther crews, of courage, fear, humor, and heartbreak, are the real heart of this rivalry. The legacy of the Sherman versus Panther duel also lives on in the tanks that followed. The lessons learned on the battlefields of Europe shaped the design of post-war armor. American tanks like the M48 and M60 Patton, and later the M1 Abrams, emphasized reliability, mobility, and the ability to fight as part of a team. Soviet tanks like the T-54 and T-62 took the Panther S sloped armor and powerful gun, but kept the focus on simplicity and mass production. Even today, modern tank designers study the strengths and weaknesses of the Sherman and Panther, looking for ways to balance firepower, protection, and mobility. In popular culture, the Sherman and Panther have become legends. They appear in movies like Fury, in video games like World of Tanks, and in countless books, documentaries, and museum exhibits. The debate over which was better continues to spark arguments and inspire new generations of history buffs. But maybe the real lesson is that there's no simple answer. Both tanks were great in their own ways, and both had flaws that could be fatal in the wrong circumstances. The Sherman versus Panther story also reminds us of the cost of war. For every tank knocked out, there were lives lost, families changed forever, and communities scarred by violence. The fields of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and the ruins of German cities are silent witnesses to the price paid by those who fought in these machines. Remembering their stories is as important as remembering the tanks themselves. So, what does the Sherman versus Panther duel mean for us today? It's a lesson in humility, in the limits of technology, and in the power of human ingenuity and resilience. It's a reminder that no weapon is invincible, and that the outcome of any battle depends on far more than just the machines involved. It's about the courage to keep fighting, the wisdom to adapt, and the humanity to remember those who came before us. As you watch this documentary, think about the men who climbed into those tanks, not knowing if they'd make it out again. Think about the engineers who worked late into the night, trying to build a better machine. Think about the families who waited for news and the communities that rebuilt after the guns fell silent. If you've enjoyed this journey through the real story of Sherman versus Panther, please like, comment, and subscribe for more untold WWII stories and deep dives into the machines and people that shaped history. What do you think is the most important lesson from this legendary tank duel? Share your thoughts below. We love hearing your take. Thank you for joining us on this ride through history. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep remembering the real stories behind the legends.